right, we are live. Welcome to Monday evening, April 27th live stream here. And we're going to be talking about one of my mentors. I think mentors can come in a lot of different varieties. There are certainly the folks that we meet and get to know in person, but I also think that anybody who's a real student of history, a student of the world, also finds mentors who they may never have met. I have lots of mentors that I never have met and never will meet. Epictetus I consider to be a mentor. Marcus Aurelius I consider to be a mentor. John Boyd I consider to be a mentor. Bill McRaven I consider to be a mentor. I may never meet. The only one living is Admiral McRaven. I doubt I'll ever meet him, but I do consider him a mentor. His work has been seminal and informative to me. Another one of my mentors is Miyamoto Musashi, and I want to talk a little bit about Musashi's work and how I think it plays into sort of understanding complex and complicated worlds and how it can help to kind of direct where we go with these things. So for those of you who are not familiar with Miyamoto Musashi, Musashi was a swordsman, warrior, itinerant samurai who was born in 16th century Japan and died in the 17th century. He was raised as a very young boy in his father's home, and then probably in his early adolescent years was eventually sent to go and live with an uncle who was a Buddhist priest. And Musashi spent his time in part growing up in his father's house, in part growing up in this temple environment. And through these formative years, he gained a lot of insight and a lot of skill into the world. He fought his first duel at the age of 13. By the time he was 16, he had left his uncle's temple, had quit living with family, and had assumed an itinerant lifestyle living on the road. Over the course of the next 13 years of his life, so until somewhere around 29 or 30 years of age, he reports as having fought in over 60 duels with other swordsmen and never having lost one. Further, he participated as both a warrior and as a leader in at least 6 large military campaigns. So those 60 duels are predominantly one-on-one, though there was some one-on-many combats that he engaged in. But in addition to that, he also fought as a retainer, effectively, for several of the clans and kind of warrior chiefs of that period in early 17th century Japan. So throughout this time, Musashi is developing this reputation as obviously an incredibly skilled swordsman, a great thinker, and a warrior of some renown. He's known really all over Japan by the time he's in his mid to late 20s. And then he retires from dueling. He says that around age 30 he retired from dueling and, quote, set myself to training day in and day out. In due course I realized the way of strategy. This was when I was about 50. So he spent so much time learning, and I think it's important to kind of trace his skill development a little bit. So he starts out studying and paying attention to his father's martial arts. His father was also a well-regarded swordsman in his own right, and young Musashi, which is his adopted name, so to speak, a name that he selected for himself, but young Musashi studied his father's martial arts from a very, very young age, and then went to live with his uncle, where he continued to study sword form at the temple. That first fight at age 13 is reported as being a very rough fight. By all accounts, It was a challenge that he had taken up from an itinerant swordsman. He enraged this man by being a 13-year-old boy who called him out, and thinking, this itinerant swordsman thought he was going to get an apology for the brashness of youth, and instead Musashi attacked. This set the man, kind of rocked him back on his heels. He didn't know what to do initially. He begins to respond. Musashi actually picks him up and slams him to the ground, and after throwing him to the ground, beats the man to death with the staff that he was carrying. So this is a very rough, unskilled fight, but it's certainly the fight of a young man who has decided he is primed for combat. He goes back to the temple for the next 3 years, continues to study, and then emerges into this world of the itinerant swordsman and takes up doing dueling on the streets and in the provinces throughout Japan. It's only after 13 years of this that in his mind he is finally ready to study strategy. And now he spends another 20 years before he reaches a point where he feels he has this very clear understanding of not only sword form, but strategy, and is truly in this place of being a teacher of these subjects. I think this is an interesting thing to think about, because if you look at it, it is in those 13 years that he is walking that itinerant life and engaging in duels and gaining experience in combat. That 13 years is about the same amount of time that it takes anyone to become an expert, a master of anything. If we use the sort of that idea of 10,000 hours of deliberate practice that that K. Anders Ericsson talks about and has published about. Most people know the 10,000 hours rule from Malcolm Gladwell's books, but it's actually the psychologist K. Anders Ericsson who's done the research to sort of document these things. And so Musashi, he's done his 10,000 hours by the time he reaches a point where he goes, okay, I have perfected sort of my practical skill, or at least polished my practical skill to the point where I feel confident that I don't need to do this anymore. I don't need to duel anymore. I've proven what I had to prove. Now he begins taking up this matter of discussing, dissecting, considering strategy. And one of the things that I'd like to focus on is sort of what we can learn from Musashi. It's important to remember that Musashi was not just a swordsman. He was an amazing artist and calligrapher as well. Several of his artworks survive to this day and are still in the care of some of the families that they were gifted to. He also was an incredible sculptor. The two works that you see here are ones that he is well known for. So this is a man who, in his deliberate practice, not only studied this very technical skill of sword fighting, but also strategy and calligraphy and sculpture and poetry and theater. This was a man who immersed himself in what he referred to as all of the ways. The ways being that very Buddhist Taoist sort of Tao, the way, a way of enlightenment. So the idea that I want to come to here, though, is one of the ones that I think is most interesting to me, and one of the ones that I think is really useful in this broader context of talking about decision making and how we react to changing and uncertain environments. And it's what is sort of this intersection of the thinking of what Musashi says about having an unmovable mind, but also having fluidity. So the image here is statues that are on an island. I'm going to attempt to pronounce this. I'm probably going to be wrong. I don't speak Japanese. But I believe it is pronounced Ganrujima. That's at least how I'm pronouncing it. And these statues are on this famous island, Ganrujima, where Musashi went and battled a swordsman named Sasaki Kijiro. And Kijiro was known as the demon of the western provinces. He was sort of the elite of elite itinerant swordsmen and eventual retainers and samurai who, once again, had this impeccable track record. Musashi committed to this duel, committed to this contest, and the idea was that he was to meet Kijiro around sunrise. I don't remember the exact time, I apologize, but he was supposed to meet around sunrise. Musashi sleeps in. He wakes up, dresses leisurely, has breakfast. He arrives several hours late for this duel that he is supposed to fight. By the time he arrives, Kijiro is incensed. He's inflamed. He is violently angry. It's said that he meets Musashi as he is stepping off the boat, challenging him, and he finds that Musashi, rather than bringing an actual sword, a sharpened sword, has carved a wooden sword from an oar. This is the final straw. This man feels that he has been slighted, he has been offended, his honor is in question. He throws his scabbard away as he draws his sword, and Musashi is said to have quipped, "You have already lost, for the victor would never throw his scabbard away." Musashi was practicing what he called immovable mind. Immovable mind is not a fixedness. Rather, it is the idea of being unaffected or unimpacted by things that are coming and happening in the environment. For Musashi, having an immovable mind means not being pushed off balance the way Kijiro is by this sudden turn of events. Kijiro has a set of expectations. His expectations are not met first and then flaunted. He feels insulted and his rage comes forth. His mind has been moved. He has been affected by Musashi's tactic. And because of this, he loses this battle. Musashi kills him, gets back on the boat, and leaves. That is one of the challenges that Musashi is presenting us with, is this idea of having an immovable mind, a mind that can be unaffected. He speaks and writes quite a bit in his book, The Book of Five Rings, about not having a fixedness or a preference for particular weapons, particular terrain, not becoming so enmeshed in a secret method or a narrow set of parameters in which you are capable of thriving, that if you are pitched outside of those moments, that you are incapable of acting, that you are thrown off. Rather, he talks a lot about having fluidity. He talks about not being fixed in our own ideas. And it may sound sort of dichotomous to say that we want to be both fluid and have an immovable mind, but I think that's where it becomes important to recognize that immovable in this context means unaffected, undisturbed, and that for the individual who is able to be undisturbed, you are now open to engaging fluidly with what's actually occurring in the environment, rather than falling back and thinking about relying on what modern psychology would refer to as our heuristics and our biases. Our heuristics being the sort of the implicit decision-making tools that we use to speed through a decision-making process and reach a conclusion. Biases being those things that we have an opinion of that may not accord with reality. Heuristics and biases form a huge component of how we think about the world. Boyd would talk about these things in terms of orientation. If we think to the OODA loop discussions that we've had and what we've talked about with Boyd, this idea of having an immovable mind would be the idea of not getting behind in the loop. The idea of being fluid would be the idea of turning inside, of remaining open to unfolding circumstances, the changing environment, new information, and using those things to engage with the environment rather than being destabilized by it, I should say. So I think that there is a lot of value in sitting down and reading Musashi and reading about Musashi. Book of Five Rings is an incredible text. There are multiple translations out there. I recommend reading more than one, as is the case with so many things that are being translated. A lot can be lost in translation, and different translators bring different understandings of the text, go and do a different amount of work to understand and decode the text, have a better or worse understanding of the historical time frame. Taking the time to read more than one translation can be really, really useful, but any translation that you start with is a good starting point. Sit down, read this book, download an audiobook, listen to it, go through it once or twice. There's actually a really good graphic novel version of Book of Five Rings that I highly recommend. It's great. It's a phenomenal introduction if you are not used to sitting down and reading a text like this. Then read a book about Musashi that gets into his history, that gets into his life. There are several good ones. I just recently finished one called The Lone Samurai that is outstanding, bar none. It's been my favorite so far. I highly recommend it. Find these thinkers that can help shape your understanding of how to apply immovable mind and fluidity, who can help you digest and consider how you look at the world around you. All we have to do is look at what's happening right now today in the last few days in the conversations that go into, do we reopen the country or not? And know that there are many people who have a very movable mind right now. They are being buffeted by the dynamic that we're in. And they have fixed ideas about what we ought to do. They are not behaving or engaging with these topics in a fluid manner. The fact of the matter is we won't know the full weight of the COVID-19 crisis, the effects of this pandemic for months, maybe over a year before we really have enough data to understand it thoroughly. And nobody will know in advance when the best time to open the economy is, whether or not sheltering in place is the only solution or is an utter disaster. We won't know that in the moment. We will only know that with hindsight. Much in the same way that researchers and epidemiologists at the time of the 1918 pandemic with the swine flu thought they had a handle on it and didn't. These are things that can only be understood in hindsight. So we need to remain fluid in our thinking. We cannot get fixed on any one notion of how things ought to be. There's a famous philosophical discussion about how one cannot derive an ought from an is. This is attributed to Hume. And the idea is that we cannot say how things ought to be because of how things are. And I think that that's an important thing, that we have to recognize when we are making these sort of normative decisions, when we are saying what ought to be. and recognize that those things come from our heuristics and biases. They come from fixed thoughts. And if we are to have the best chance of engaging with what is happening in the environment at the moment, we need to maintain fluidity. We need to know what those heuristics and biases are and know how to step back from them. I think that what Musashi has to offer can help guide us in that way. So I hope you'll take the time to sit down, read Musashi, dig into Musashi, and enjoy that work. So with that in mind, I want to say thanks very much for everybody who is tuning in, either watching these videos live or watching the archived versions. I appreciate the comments, the text messages, the direct messages that I've been getting about these things. If you enjoy these videos, the easiest thing that you can do is like them, subscribe to the channel, and share them. If you want to do just a little bit more, you can support me on Patreon. Patreon.com/ChrisFSW. Patreon supporters get access to some exclusive content. They get access to early content in a lot of cases, and it is a great way of supporting the efforts that go into making this happen, making these videos happen. In this last week or two now, I have been starting to steadily roll out the Boyd Book Club videos that I created for patrons last year, and we'll continue to roll out semester 1 and semester 2 of Boyd Book Club. Maybe we'll be picking up a semester 3 of Boyd Book Club soon. I've been reconfiguring the ideas that I had for that back in August, and I'm thinking about some new ways of engaging with that. There's also a lot of new content that's going to be coming out, both on Fire Service Warrior and on the new channel I've set up called Body at Large. So you can check out Body at Large if you're interested there. So with that said, I would particularly like to thank the patrons who are already giving support, especially Kevin Richson, Travis, Adam Mayers, Chase Morgan, Eddie Crombie, James Klatsky, Justin Ide, Ryan Trader, Brandon Douglas, Brock Clapp, David Hinosa, Eric Chisholm, Timothy Bullard, Zach Reidel, Andrew Murtaugh, Brent Weigand, I'm going to get it one of these days, Brent, I promise, Chris Bondis, Chuck Hammond, Craig Wall, Elliot Harris, Mark Bates, Matthew Spangler, Stephen, Trevor Harderhorst. Thank you all for the efforts, the support, the encouragement. See you soon. Cheers.